The first thing that fell off was the trash bin, not the smell. The position, it had been pulled forward from under the counter and angled open toward the register, close enough to be used without stepping away. In a place built around clean lines and predictable movement, that placement suggested intent, a tool positioned before a task. I was seated 2 tables from the counter, close enough to hear the grinder cycle on and off, far enough that I wasn't part of the line. Lunch hour. Orders are moving in sequence. No delays logged on the screen. The man at the counter stepped into place when the register cleared. He didn't hesitate, didn't scan the menu. He placed cash flat on the marble and waited. Hands open. Transaction posture complete. The manager approached. Emily Parker. Badge visible. Terminal active. She didn't request a name or confirm the order. She reached forward and slid the bills sideways, not back across the counter, but down. The cash dropped into the open bin. No bounce, no correction. The register remained idle. No refund code entered, no void recorded. The transaction was left unresolved. No one reacted immediately. The line behind him held position. No one advanced. The system paused without being told to. Emily wiped her fingers with a napkin. Then she took the disinfectant bottle and sprayed the exact square of marble where the cash had been placed. One spray, then another. She wiped until the surface squeaked, resetting the counter without resetting the transaction. A customer at the window stopped stirring her drink. A fork paused over a plate at the corner table. No one spoke. The queue remained stalled. The man didn't reach for the bin. He didn't step back into line. He remained at the register, occupying the space where the transaction should have closed. "I'd like to speak with your manager," he said. Emily didn't check the system. She didn't ask what the issue was. She crossed her arms and shifted her weight back. "You're looking at her." No escalation code was entered. No complaint form initiated. A second customer stepped up behind him. Same counter, same minute. Similar jacket. Emily's posture adjusted. She turned slightly, breaking alignment with the stalled transaction. "Good afternoon, sir." She pulled a ceramic cup from the warmer and placed it on a saucer. The espresso machine engaged. The register advanced for the next order without clearing the previous one. For the man still standing at the counter, she slid a paper-to-go cup forward, lid already sealed, despite his earlier request to dine in. The ceramic cup behind the counter remained unused. The system now showed 2 open states. 1 active order, 1 unresolved payment. The man's hands stayed where they were. No tapping, no clenched fists. Stillness consistent with someone waiting for a process to resume. In the corner, a college student raised her phone. The screen brightened. She held it low, angled toward the counter. Emily noticed. "No filming," she said. "Company policy." She didn't point to a posted notice. None was visible. The policy existed only in her voice. The student adjusted her grip. The camera stayed on. Emily reached for the phone behind the counter. "Security to the front," she said. "Aggressive customer." The word entered the space without matching input. No raised voice, no physical movement. The label didn't correspond to observed behavior. I looked up at the display above the kitchen pass. A digital timer glowed red. 8 minutes remaining. A health inspection clock is already running. Kitchen staff slowed their movement. Prep stations stayed occupied longer than necessary. Attention shifted away from the line and toward the counter. The man's phone vibrated once. He glanced down, silenced it without unlocking the screen, and returned it to his jacket. No notification sound. No follow-up motion. Emily wiped the counter again. The paper cup remained untouched. Security arrived. Frank Miller. Radio clipped high. He positioned himself just off the man's right shoulder, close enough to assert presence without blocking access. "Sir," Frank said, "you need to step away from the counter." The man looked at him, then back to Emily. "Who authorized that?" No one answered. The register remained active. The earlier transaction still hadn't been closed. The inspection timer dropped another minute. Red digits. No pause granted. A man in a gray suit entered and stopped just inside the door. He didn't cue, he didn't speak. He observed the counter, the security position, and the stalled line. Emily's badge caught the overhead light. The trash bin remained open. The room hadn't grown quiet from emotion. It had quieted because the system was waiting for an instruction it wasn't receiving. The man at the counter still hadn't identified himself. He didn't need to. Not yet. The counter stayed blocked after security arrived. Not physically, procedurally. The register continued to accept new inputs, while the first transaction remained open. Orders printed, cups moved. The line behind the man adjusted by half steps, not forward, just enough to signal compliance without resolution. Frank Miller shifted his stance closer. His radio stayed quiet. No code was called in. He waited for confirmation that didn't come. "Sir," he repeated, "you need to step away from the counter." The man didn't argue. He didn't comply either. He stayed aligned with the register, occupying the space reserved for completion. "Who authorized that?" he asked again. Emily Parker didn't answer the question. She turned toward the terminal, tapped the screen, then stopped. No supervisor override. No escalation menu selected. She wiped the counter once more, slower this time, as if motion itself might substitute for instruction. Behind the counter, the barista hesitated before pulling the next shot. The machine beeped twice, then idled. The printer spat out a receipt that no one picked up. The inspection timer above the kitchen dropped to 6 minutes. Red digits. No pause requested. No extension logged. Emily leaned toward Frank, lowering her voice without lowering the message. "He's refusing to leave." That wasn't accurate, but it was close enough to function. Frank nodded once. His hand moved toward the radio, then stopped. He looked at the man again, recalibrating. The posture didn't match the label. No agitation, no encroachment, just presence. A woman near the door glanced at the timer, then at her watch. She gathered her bag and stepped out of line. The system registered a loss without recording a reason. The college student in the corner kept her phone steady. Viewer count climbed. The screen reflected red digits from the inspection clock. Emily noticed the reflection. "No filming," she said again louder. "This is private property." She reached for the phone behind the counter and pressed a single button. The line connected. "Corporate systems are down," she said into the receiver. "I need guidance." She didn't wait for a response. She hung up and set the phone back in place, the call unlogged, the claim unverifiable. The man watched the phone, then the register. "That decision isn't yours," he said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't raised. It landed as a statement of scope. Emily stiffened. She straightened her badge and squared her shoulders, reclaiming posture if not authority. "I'm asking you to leave," she said. "You're disrupting service." Service metrics told a different story. 2 orders are delayed. 1 customer exited the queue. The inspection clock continued to run. Frank took a half step forward, enough to mark intent. "Sir," he said, "if you don't comply, I'll have to escalate." The man nodded once, acknowledging the process, not the demand. "On what grounds?" Frank hesitated. He glanced at Emily. She didn't provide language. No policy cited. No trespass warning issued. The escalation path stalled at the threshold. The man reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately. Frank's hand lifted, hovering near the radio. "I'm retrieving identification," the man said, as requested. The zipper sound carried farther than it should have. Conversations in the room dropped off. The kitchen noise dulled. The inspection timer hit 5 minutes. From the back, a woman stepped through the kitchen pass holding a clipboard. Susan Clark, Health Department. She scanned the room, clocked the security posture, the stalled counter, and the open bin. "What's the delay?" she asked. Emily turned too quickly. "Minor customer issue," she said. "We're handling it." Susan looked at the timer, then at the register, then at the open transaction. "I don't see handling," she said. "I see disruption." She marked something on her clipboard. The sound of pen on paper cut through the room. The man's hand paused at the zipper. He didn't open it further. He waited. Emily's voice tightened. "We're under inspection," she said, as if that settled the matter. Susan didn't respond. She stepped behind the counter and looked directly at the terminal. "This transaction hasn't been closed," she said. "Why?" Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. Any explanation required an authorization she didn't have. The suited man near the door stepped closer. Not in line, just close enough to be seen. "Is this how you normally resolve customer disputes?" he asked. Emily turned toward him, searching for an ally she hadn't verified. Before she could speak, the man at the counter finished unzipping his jacket. He removed a single card and placed it on the marble. No logo oversized. No flourish. Just placement. The room adjusted around that small change. Frank lowered his hand. Susan leaned in slightly to read. Emily froze, badge catching the light again, no longer centered. The system finally recognized a valid input. For the first time since the cash hit the bin, the register stopped blinking, and a name entered the space where it should have been all along. The card remained on the marble. No one touched it. The register stopped blinking, not frozen idle. The unresolved transaction cleared, and the queue advanced by one place without anyone moving. The system had accepted a valid input. Susan Clark stepped closer to the terminal and read silently. She didn't ask questions. She entered a short sequence, then turned the screen outward. Inspection paused, she said. Disruption logged. Mandatory review initiated. Emily Parker nodded too quickly. We were handling it. Susan marked another line on her clipboard. Handling requires authorization. Frank Miller shifted his stance away from the counter, not toward it. His radio stayed clipped. No call went out. The suited observer near the door finally spoke. Regional operations, he said. I was scheduled to observe today. He looked at the paused clock, the cleared register, and the open bin beneath the counter. Who authorized the security call? Emily answered without looking up. I did. No one asked why. The question had already done its work. Susan stepped behind the counter. She typed again. The terminal refreshed. Manager override suspended pending review, she read aloud. Effective immediately. Emily reached for the keyboard and stopped. The input field was locked. This isn't disciplinary, the observer said. It's administrative. A soft chime sounded from the terminal. Another line appeared. HR notification sent. Termination code. 4.2, unauthorized intervention during inspection. Effective. Immediately. No one announced it. No one needed to. The payroll icon grayed out. The schedule tab cleared. The badge light on Emily's lanyard blinked once, then went dark. Frank noticed first. He took a full step back, clearing the counter. Susan tore the yellow copy from her pad and placed it face down. 14 issues, she said. Documented. Follow-up will be routed. Emily stood still. She unclipped her badge and set it on the marble, where the card had been minutes earlier. The bin was pushed back under the counter quietly by a staff member who hadn't spoken all afternoon. Service resumed one order at a time. The printer chirped. Cups moved. The line shortened. A customer who had stepped out earlier returned and took a seat. The man at the counter picked up his card last and slid it into his jacket without looking at it. Susan closed her clipboard. The observer nodded once and stepped aside. Frank returned to his post near the door, radio still silent. Another soft chime. A new message appeared on the terminal. Interim lead assigned, shift coverage confirmed. The barista, who had paused earlier, glanced at the screen. Her access indicator turned green. No applause, no announcement. She took the next order and moved with practiced economy. A second message followed. Incident reporter acknowledged. Compliance credit logged. The college student lowered her phone. The stream ended on its own. Emily was escorted toward the back hallway, not hurried, not resisted. Her access had already been removed. There was nothing left to contest. The inspection clock restarted, green this time. I waited until the grinder cycled again, and the room found its rhythm. The marble was clean, the register was clear, the bin was closed. On my way out, I looked back at the counter. The system wasn't celebrating, it was operating. If you stayed to the end, comment where you're watching from. Share this story if you've ever seen authority cross a line quietly. And subscribe to Black CEO Tales for more stories about power, process, and what happens when systems enforce their own boundaries.